From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. On today's program, we'll be taking a look at the year ahead and talking to scholars from across MEI about the key issues, trends, and developments that they'll be watching in 2021. We'll kick things off with MEI Vice President Gerald Feierstein and a discussion of the Gulf and Yemen. Jerry, thank you for joining us today, and welcome back to the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Alistair, and looking forward to a bright 2021.
That makes two of us. Jerry, President-elect Joe Biden will be sworn in next week. Given what we know now from his public statements and the announcements of key personnel, what are your expectations for the new administration when it comes to Middle East policy? What are the key changes that we're likely to see this year?
Well, in terms of the Gulf, of course, the major issue and one of the major campaign themes for the incoming administration was what to do about Iran, whether or not there's going to be an opportunity for the U.S. to re-engage with Iran, to come back into the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, or to otherwise change the nature of our relationship with Iran going forward. And of course, for the Gulf states, this has huge implications. How are they going to respond to the initiatives that we anticipate that the Biden administration will take that will change the dynamic in the Gulf? And maybe, and this is something that several of the GCC states fear, maybe going back to the period when they were very concerned about the approach that the Obama administration was taking on Iran, which they believed was being undertaken at their expense. So there's going to be a change in the dynamic. This strategy that the Trump administration has pursued of maximum pressure against the Iranians, which by and large was welcomed by at least the more assertive GCC states, is going to change. How it's going to change, and how is the Biden administration going to address the Gulf states and hopefully ease their concerns about the risk to their own safety and security that these changes might incur.
2020 was a year of upheaval and transition in the Gulf, from COVID-19 and the economic downturn to the passing of two of the region's longest-serving leaders. Beyond relations with Washington, what are your expectations for the region in 2021?
Well, of course, we saw that the GCC did come together and at least papered over their differences at the summit that the Saudis hosted in Al Ula earlier in January. And so the question really for the GCC states internally is whether or not this is marking a significant change in the nature of their internal relations. Are they going to be able to move forward to strengthen their cooperation, particularly in the defense and security arenas, but also in some of the other areas like the economics and the social issues? Are they going to be able to move forward on that? Or is this simply an interruption in what has been a tense relationship over a number of years? And as you said, the passing of the leadership in Oman and in Kuwait to new leaders, to Sultan Haytham in Oman and to Sheikh Nawaf in Kuwait, also removes from the scene two of the leaders who really kept the GCC together and who were the kind of the glue that held the organization together for so many years. So what does their departure from the scene mean in terms of how the organization will continue? If there is further disruption, if there's further conflict within the organization, who is going to pick up the baton and try to calm the situation and bring everybody back together again? And that's going to be something that we're going to be watching very carefully over this coming year.
Shifting gears to Yemen, as you put it in a recent article, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo left a poison pill for the Biden administration in the form of the Houthi foreign terrorist organization designation announced earlier this week. What are the likely ramifications of that move, and is the FTO designation something the new administration can easily roll back?
Well, this is, as I said, and as you just quoted, I think it's a poison pill for the new administration. It really is not justified by the objective standards of the foreign terrorist designation or by Houthi behavior. It's not to defend the Houthis. It's not to express any sympathy for the Houthis. Certainly, they are responsible for this terrible situation that Yemen confronts today after 7 years of civil war. But it is problematic not only in the immediate future, where clearly the Biden administration wanted to use Yemen really as a jumping off point to try to reduce tensions in the region and hopefully to begin this process that we talked about of resolving some of the tensions with Iran and perhaps getting back into some kind of a dialogue, some kind of a negotiation with them that could address not only the nuclear file, but some of the other issues. It's going to be more complicated for the Biden administration now, whether or not they will be able to participate, as had been hoped, more fully in the efforts that Martin Griffith is making on trying to get a political process going. Martin has been working very hard on completing what's called the Joint Declaration, which would establish a ceasefire in Yemen and would hopefully open up the possibilities for a return to the political process. Whether the Biden administration is going to be able to pursue that right now is an open question. But it's also a problem going forward if there is a resolution of the conflict. I think most people assume that the Houthis will have a role to play in a future Yemeni government, in a future Yemeni political system. And if this designation stands, then it's going to complicate the ability of the Biden administration to cooperate with the new Yemen government and to work with them on some of the issues that are going to be critical in terms of stabilizing Yemen, helping for the recovery and reconstruction of Yemen after these years of conflict, and also to continue what is going to be a priority going forward for the administration and for the United States, and that is to cooperate with the new government in Yemen to confront Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and hopefully to defeat it and destroy it. So there are a number of implications for what the Trump administration has done as it walks out the door. In terms of what the Biden administration can do to undo the damage that this designation has inflicted, technically speaking, bureaucratically speaking, there is a way forward for the new administration to delist the Houthis. Basically, the process for delisting is the same as the process for listing, which is that they need to give Congress 7 days notice of their intention to do that, to give Congress an opportunity to object. But even if the technical process is fairly straightforward and doable, there is a political aspect to this. It's not only a question of can the Biden administration do it, but it's also a question of will they do it? What are the political implications domestically for their doing that? Are they exposing themselves to criticism by hardliners on the Republican side who will use delisting as a way of arguing that the Biden administration is soft on terrorism? That is something that they're going to have to take into account. And then the other reality is, look at the agenda that the Biden administration has, look at the number of issues that have to be addressed on an urgent basis. as soon as the Biden administration comes into office next week? And where is this question of delisting the Houthis going to fall on their priority list? Is this something that they're prepared to do quickly? Or is this something that is going to have to hold while the Biden administration addresses these other far more urgent issues, particularly domestic issues? The one positive note that I could make about this is that the congressional response, the reaction on the Hill to this designation, bipartisan from both Republicans and Democrats, has been overwhelmingly negative. They did not approve of the Trump decision. They gave the administration officials who were briefing them a very hard time. They have the same concerns that many other people have, which is that this decision to designate the Houthis will have little or no effect on the Houthis themselves, but potentially could be disastrous for innocent Yemeni civilians who are dependent on the international community, dependent on international humanitarian organizations to help them get through this catastrophic period of time that they're confronting. So it could very well be that if the Biden administration does take steps to delist the Houthis and to push away this Trump administration decision, there may in fact be broad bipartisan acceptance on the Hill that this is the right decision.
Given all the challenges you've laid out here, do you think 2021 is the year when we'll finally see a peace deal take shape in Yemen?
What we've seen and what we've heard from Martin Griffiths in his statements to the UN Security Council and elsewhere is that he believes that he can complete what he's calling the joint declaration, which would establish a ceasefire, would reopen the airport in Sana'a, and take other steps that hopefully will calm the situation and allow him to proceed on pursuing a political dialogue that could hopefully pave the way for some a resolution of the situation and move into the next steps. So all of those things, I think, are possible this year. One can hope that we get there this year. But we shouldn't underestimate the long-term effects and the challenges that are going to confront Yemen, even if we do have a ceasefire, even if we do have an end to the major source of conflict inside of Yemen. I think that the law and order situation in Yemen is going to remain very unsettled for a long time to come. Political situation very unsettled for a long time to come. So while we can hope that at least we will end the suffering, we'll end the catastrophe this year, we should understand that the recovery of Yemen, that the reconstruction of Yemen is going to be a process that's going to require many years of dedicated work, both within Yemen, among the Yemenis, but also support from the international community.
Before we wrap up, are there any other issues that you'll be watching particularly closely over the coming months?
Well, the other aspect, and let me just say very quickly, of course, is the question of the changing dynamics between the Gulf states and Israel. One of the big questions, of course, is whether or not there's going to be movement in terms of the Saudi-Israeli relationship over the course of this year. It's not at all clear whether the Saudis are ready to move forward on that. But we're also going to be watching, of course, the implications of the normalization of relations between the UAE and Bahrain on one side and the Israelis on the other. Big question whether Qatar is going to follow suit this year, whether Oman is going to follow suit this year. And so in terms of the broader implications and the broader U.S. strategies in the Middle East, is there going to be this very fundamental change in terms of Israeli Gulf relations?
Jerry, we'll have to leave things there for now, but thank you very much for joining the program today.
Well, it's been a pleasure. We'll see you soon, Alistair.
Next up, we'll be talking about Iran with Alex Vatanka. Alex is the director of MEI's Iran program and a senior fellow with the Frontier Europe Initiative. Alex, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Alistair.
Alex, Iran was the central, some might say overriding focus of the Trump administration's Middle East policy, during which time tensions between the two sides ratcheted up dramatically. Where do things stand now, and is it fair to say the relationship between Washington and Tehran is as bad as it's ever been in the post-1979 era?
Oh, certainly. If you go back to 1979 and follow the years to today, you've never had the kinds of American pressures on the Islamic Republic that the Trump administration put on that Iranian Islamist regime in Tehran. So that caught them to some extent by surprise, and yet they never felt that the Trump administration actually was willing to go all the way. And what do I mean by go all the way? From Iran's perspective, going all the way literally only meant one thing: the military option. The Iranian regime read Trump to be someone who was happy to put pressure on Iran. All the economic sanctions that one could conceive of were in fact put on Iran. But the Iranian regime just knew that Trump wasn't a war president, if you will. And that was the one thing they feared more than anything else. And because they didn't think he would wage war on them, they decided to hold back and never actually responded positively to Trump's repeated message of come back to the table, negotiate with me, and you might have another nuclear deal with President Trump that is even better than President Obama. The Iranians decided not ever to go there. And, it turned out that buying time worked for them in this case. If President Trump had been reelected, it's a huge question if the Islamic Republic could have stayed the course for another 4 years. In fact, signs were that they were ready to, look for ways to talk to Trump had he been reelected. But lucky for the Islamic Republic, President Trump was not reelected. And now the Iranians are preparing themselves for what they expect would be new rounds of negotiations with the Biden administration. They don't want to show up at the table of negotiations with a weak hand. They want to show up from their perspective with a strong hand. And that's what you're seeing all these messages from Iran, decisions they've made in recent days and weeks, including enriching uranium to 20%. All of that is to buy not time, but create leverage. So when they show up at the talks, which most of us expect to happen sooner rather than later, that they have something to negotiate with the Biden administration about.
When it comes to U.S. Middle East policy, Iran is expected to be the area where we'll see the biggest changes from the Trump to the Biden administration. As you kind of touched on just now, there are a lot of variables at play here, but what are your expectations for how that'll play out?
On paper, Iranian national interest would be served if the U.S. and Iran talked. Now, there will not be comfortable talks. There are so many issues that keep the two sides apart, not to mention the nature of this Iranian system regime, if you will, including violation of the rights of Iranian people, what many of us consider to be Iranian adventurism in the Middle East in terms of what Iran does in the region, places like Iraq and Syria. Granted, Iran is not the only country that engages in what we will call adventurism. Other countries are at it as well. But I guess my point is there are a number of issues that will keep the two parties apart, despite the fact that you have a new administration in Washington that wants to give diplomacy another go. The question very quickly becomes how small or how big are the two sides going to shoot for the new round of negotiations in terms of the scope of various issues to talk about. And my feeling right now is that they're going to be narrow. They're going to focus on the nuclear issue. If there is any success achieved in that context, if they can revive what's left of the 2015 nuclear deal, the so-called JCPOA, if they can do that, then perhaps as a result of those early stages of success, you can create some confidence building in the process and then move on to more thorny subjects. And we all know the list of things that Iran and the U.S. will continue to disagree about, including the nature of Iran's missile program, Iran's regional agenda, and there are some key issues from Washington's perspective, certainly from the perspective of the U.S. Congress, that I just cannot imagine that they will go away, including Iran's position on the state of Israel. So there are a lot of issues to talk about. And in many ways, we're going to go back to the concerns that were raised by the Trump administration. I mean, what was a key issue the Trump administration had with the Obama-Iran nuclear deal of 2015? That it wasn't ambitious enough, that they didn't cover all the various issues that the U.S. is concerned about. Trump tried, his administration tried with the so-called maximum pressure campaign, hoping that will do the trick. It didn't. And now the Biden administration, having seen what the maximum pressure campaign did, and having known, because people who were going to be in the Biden administration are the ones who actually signed the nuclear deal or were the ones who were the architects of the original 2015 nuclear deal, they can take their own experiences from the 2015 deal, the experience of the Trump administration of the last 4 years, and then maybe come up with a whole new way of going about the business of coming up with a sustainable nuclear deal, but also one that quickly allows for the conversation to be broadened. Because frankly, I think everyone would agree the only way you can have a deal on the nuclear issue that's sustainable is if you create confidence to talk about other matters of concern, like Iran's missile program, regional agenda, pretty quickly after you've made initial success.
Deeply sensitive issues for Iran, the missile program, its regional activities. What do you think it would take for Tehran to be willing to consider kind of extending the conversation to include those?
You see, the problem we have, Alistair, is so much of politics for every country is about what's going on locally in their own capitals. And in the case of Tehran, you don't really have a good agreement, even within the Iranian regime, which is made up of Islamists. Now, there are different types of Islamists. You got the so-called moderates, pragmatics. You got the hardliners. And there isn't really much of a solid agreement from what I can see in terms of what to do with the United States. And in fact, it's not so much about the United States. It's a bigger question. It's almost a philosophical question. What ought to be Iran or the Islamic Republic's future relations with the rest of the world? And there is so many different differences of opinion in Tehran on that question. I give you one example. Financial Action Task Force, this basic agreement that countries sign up to be able to take part in financial institutions around the world. So banks from Iran can be able to transfer funds to other banks around the world. Iran is one of the very few countries, I think the only other country that has not signed up to FATF's basic standards, and there are a number of different clauses to it. Iran cannot come up internally with agreement on whether to do this or not, because the fear is that if you allow international institutions to come in by signing all these various agreements, that you dilute the nature of the Iranian revolutionary state and the hardliners in Iran. For them, that is a net loss. They fear that day. Therefore, they're opposed to not just relations with the United States, but even smaller policy issues, like, as I said, the FATF question, and never mind the very challenging questions that they will have to deal with along the way, like Iran's position on Israel. So in many ways, and this is the challenge for the Biden administration, what can the U.S. or the rest of the world do to get a collective Iranian body to decide which way they want to go? Do they really want to go and remain isolated, remain sanctioned, and essentially become a North Korea of the Middle East? Or do they want to break that isolation? Because if they want to break the isolation, the U.S. question is one they have to make changes to, but there are a whole host of other issues that they need to sort of work through and make changes to. And that is why it's such a difficult, complicated, and basically a zero-sum game inside the ranks of the Iranian regime, because the hardliners see big change coming at their expense, and they are so committed as of today to resist big style change, which is exactly what we need to see before major events or changes can happen in 2021.
Beyond the U.S. to the Gulf region, we've seen some significant geopolitical developments in the Gulf, from the Abraham Accords to the resolution of the GCC crisis in recent months. How has all of that been perceived in Tehran, and how does that shape the kind of leadership's calculus moving forward?
As of right now, they're still in a sort of wait-and-see mode. They don't necessarily think that the new mediation and resolution of the differences between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, UAE, means much for Iran. I mean, what from an Iranian perspective, from the Islamic Republic's perspective, if the Gulf states became one in terms of their demands of Iran, that would really be a challenge for the Iranians. But we're not there yet. I mean, what we know so far is Qatar, for example, has made, if you will, peace with the Saudi Arabians and the Emiratis, but did not agree to reducing its relations with Iran or Turkey, for that matter. So, in other words, you have an Iran that definitely is sensing a sense of pressure. The Abraham Accords, probably more so than anything else. This is the first time in the history of the Islamic Republic that the state of Israel has a diplomatic presence not far from Iran's shores to its south. So, I guess from a political diplomatic point of view, this is a new phenomenon. They have to figure out how they're going to position themselves for the rest of this year and years to come. The Iranians probably are very anxious to see the level of military intelligence cooperation between UAE, Bahrain, perhaps other Gulf states, and Israel, because the Iranians will see themselves to be in the firing line of that sort of cooperation. But more importantly, I guess, Alistair, than anything else, is the Abraham Accords has resulted in something very new and original, which is to say, yes, Israel's treatment of the Palestinians isn't always good. Don't take my word for it. Read Israeli press. But what's the best way forward? Is it Iran's long-held position of so-called militant resistance, the model that Iran promotes by supporting groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas? Or is the way forward something different? Diplomacy, confidence building, negotiations, investing in one another's well-being and so forth, which is exactly what the Abraham Accords is about. Now, it's too early to judge the successes of Abraham Accords. I mean, we're only literally a few months into this. Much can happen. But if this thing takes off as a new phenomenon, as a new kind of ball game, if you will, in the Middle East, then Iran really will have a tough time justifying its position of supporting the sort of militant model, if you will, not just in the region, but also at home. Because remember, a big part of why Iran is isolated, it's not just necessarily its nuclear program. It's sort of revolutionary model that it likes to export to the rest of the region, which is why the neighbors are so, if you will, scared, intimidated by what Iran wants to do. It is, after all, a pretty large state of 83 million people, a country the size of Alaska, and where it decides to go and where it decides to spend its resources will shape so much of realities elsewhere in the Middle East. So the Gulf states will be a top foreign policy issue for 2021 for Iran. I don't expect either side wants to fuel the tensions into something bigger. Certainly, I don't anticipate a military conflict of any sort. But as I said, the Gulf states have decided, or some of them have decided, to go a separate way. And that separate way, that separate model, which is about coexistence, including with Israel, will be a challenge for the Iranians, that they need to think hard about it in the coming year in terms of how they can either go around it or double down on their militant foreign policy.
Finally, before we wrap up, are there any other issues or trends that you'll be paying particular attention to in the coming months?
The big issue 2021 for Iran, I don't think it's the Iranian presidential election of June of this year. I think that's a foregone conclusion at this point. The reform movement in Iran is dead. Gradual reform will not be happening anytime in this year, which means that you will have a smaller and smaller group of people inside the Islamic Republic deciding which way the country is going to go. They have a track record of putting their own narrow factional political interest, above everything else, oftentimes at the expense of Iranian national interests. And that is my worry, that they will take the country in the wrong direction, as opposed to looking for ways to build bridges, be it with the United States or neighbors, that they will double down on the so-called revolutionary model, be it how they behave at home towards their own people or in the region. That is a nightmare scenario. I hope it's not going to happen. I hope they're going to go in a different direction, that they're going to negotiate, that they're going to look for ways to build bridges across the board. But that could be just me wishful thinking, or perhaps I might be wrong, and that's exactly what could happen.
We'll just have to wait and see. Alex, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Next up, we'll be talking about Turkey with Gonul Tol. Gonul is the director of MEI's Turkey program and a senior fellow with the Frontier Europe Initiative. Gonul, thank you for joining us today, and welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Alistair.
Gonul, from foreign policy challenges to economic woes, 2020 was a difficult year for Turkey, both at home and abroad. Where do things stand at the beginning of 2021, and what are the most pressing issues facing Ankara?
That's right, Alistair. 2020 was a very difficult year for the country, which saw a dramatic increase in the number of COVID cases. And like other emerging markets, Turkey was hard hit. The Turkish currency lira lost 10% of its value in March and April alone. And more importantly, Erdogan kept losing ground in the polls. To expand his ruling coalition, which currently includes the ultra-nationalist party and a few other nationalist parties, both on the left and right, Erdogan reached out to the Islamist party. He held meetings with a center-left party and an ethnic Kurdish party that draws votes from conservative Kurds. None of these parties have the backing of large majorities. Their vote shares hover around 1%, but in the current system in which the winner has to capture 50% plus 1, even 1% is important. And besides, Erdogan has no choice but to look for potential allies, given his alliance with the nationalists does not secure him that 20% plus 1. And another significant factor to keep an eye on this year is Erdogan's nationalist ally, Devlet Bahçeli's call to close down the pro-Kurdish party. Erdogan dismissed these calls in the past, but they've been growing louder. Pro-Kurdish parties have been closed down by the Constitutional Court for their alleged links to terrorism in the past, only to be relaunched under a different name. So if Erdogan were to pursue such a course, it would only strengthen the Kurds' resolve to support the opposition. So this is the domestic front. And on the foreign policy front, a few things to keep an eye on. Turkey and Greece have been at loggerheads over energy exploration and maritime boundaries in Eastern Mediterranean. And the conflict dragged other parties, with France and the US siding with Greece. Greece also signed agreements with Egypt and Israel, making them a party to the conflict as well. So Eastern Mediterranean has been a major source of tension for Turkey in the past year. And Turkey and Greece recently agreed to meet on January 25th in Istanbul for further talks. To be frank, I'm not holding my breath. The problems are too deep to be resolved with one meeting, but it's still something to follow.
Closer to home, President-elect Joe Biden will be sworn in here in Washington next week. How do you expect U.S.-Turkey relations to change under the new U.S. administration?
Erdogan and Trump's personal chemistry played an important role in bilateral ties. On many occasions, Trump shielded Erdogan from punishment for a series of provocative decisions. And there's no such chemistry between Biden and Erdogan. In an interview with the New York Times editorial board in, I believe, late 2019, Biden called Erdogan an autocrat and called for more support to the opposition. So we can expect Biden to call out Turkey's human rights violations, something we didn't see under this administration. And the S-400 issue will remain another big problem. Turkey purchased the Russian S-400 defense system and angered its NATO allies. And Trump was pressured by the Congress to impose the CAATSA sanctions that were designed to punish those countries who made significant purchases of Russian military equipment. And the sanctions were approved by U.S. lawmakers a few years ago. And Trump resisted those calls from the Congress. But on his way out of office, he finally sanctioned Turkey. And those sanctions include a ban on all U.S. export licenses and loans to Turkey's Defense Procurement Agency, and an asset freeze on the agency's president, among other government officials. So the law, the CATS, allows the U.S. administration to impose even harsher sanctions. The U.S. demands a resolution to the problem, but there is no face-saving way for Erdogan to back down on the S-400s. And given the tight majority the Democrats command in both houses of the Congress, Biden will be under pressure to keep the pressure on Erdogan. But of course, this doesn't mean that Biden will be all sticks and no carrots in his approach to Turkey. He will work with Turkey where he can, be it in Syria or Libya, and pressure Erdogan when it's necessary. In Syria, Turkey's anti-Kurdish policy, particularly in northeastern Syria, where U.S. is working closely with the Syrian Kurds, has strained relations. But Turkey's policies in northwestern Syria, places like in Idlib, where Turkey has been fending off a complete regime takeover of the last rebel stronghold, it's an area where U.S. and Turkish interests converge. So we can expect this to continue under the new administration. In Libya, where Turkey militarily intervened to support the UN-backed Tripoli government, there's a diplomatic process underway. And to the extent that Turkey is constructive in those diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict, the U.S. can work with Turkey. But in other places, such as Eastern Mediterranean, Turkey-U.S. tension will remain high.
Shifting gears to the Middle East, Turkey finds itself facing a changing regional environment there as well. There have been a number of significant developments in the past few months: Arab-Israeli rapprochement under the Abraham Accords, the beginning of talks, as you just mentioned, and growing Egyptian involvement in Libya, and the recent Solidarity and Stability Agreement announced at the end of the GCC summit last week. How are these developments being perceived in Ankara, and what impact, if any, will they have on Turkish regional policy moving forward, in your view?
Well, Turkey welcomed the agreement between Qatar and other Gulf countries. As you know, Turkey and Qatar has been very close allies, acting together in places such as Syria and Libya. I don't expect a dramatic change in Qatar's policy in these places after the agreement, which means the agreement might not have an immediate negative impact. Qatar sees Turkey as a foul-weather friend who was there when Qatar needed help the most after 2017 Saudi-led blockade. So Turkey-Qatar relations will not change dramatically. Arab states normalizing relations with Israel leaves Turkey as one of the few countries left to champion the Palestinian cause. But in practice, I'm not sure whether Turkey's pro-Palestinian stance means much. It obviously it affords Turkey popularity among the people in the region, but practically I doubt it means anything. And besides, Turkey has been signaling its desire to normalize ties with Israel, but the Israeli side is not as enthusiastic given how Israeli politics shifted right and the upcoming elections and Turkey's support for Hamas. So all these things complicate normalization efforts. And Egypt is trying to establish ties with the Tripoli government in Libya, something that we didn't see before, and that's potentially a significant development. And depending on how engaged Egypt will be with the Tripoli government, Turkey might have to factor in Egypt's presence in an area where it had dominated so far.
As you noted at the beginning, I think it's fair to say 2020 was a difficult year for Turkey-EU relations as well. According to a statement released earlier this week by President Erdogan's office, Turkey wants to, quote, turn a new page in relations with the EU in the new year, end quote. Does that seem realistic, or is it just rhetoric? What are your kind of expectations here?
Well, with everything going on in Turkey and the EU, I don't see a realistic path out of the current impasse in relations. Turkey has become an authoritarian country under Erdogan's watch. And the more authoritarian it became at home, the more aggressive it got on the foreign policy front. So an aggressive militaristic foreign policy outlook became the natural extension of Erdogan's authoritarian turn at home. And that means Erdogan cannot dramatically change his regional policies, and he will not become a democratic either. And although he's been talking about carrying out reforms at home, and you have an EU that is less and less tolerant towards Muslim immigrants. Far right and right wing populism have become an important political force in Europe in the last few years. And these things make Turkey's membership a toxic issue for Europeans. So in such a context, I don't see how parties can overcome their differences. But of course, this doesn't mean we should expect a complete breakdown in ties. Turkey and the EU are mutually dependent on each other due to trade and immigration. So they will find a way of continuing on the current dysfunctional path.
Finally, before we wrap up, I wanted to touch on Russia, with which Turkey has a complicated relationship. While the two countries have close ties in some areas, like energy and defense cooperation, they are at odds in others, especially on the foreign policy front in places like Libya, Syria, and the South Caucasus this past year. How do you see that dynamic playing out in 2021?
Turkey and Russia managed to prevent policy differences from incurring a long-lasting damage on their partnership in other areas. Idlib, which is the northwestern Syrian town and the last rebel stronghold, will continue to be a problem. Russia expects Turkey to solve the problem of radical Islamist groups, but so far Turkey has failed to do so. In Libya, Turkey and Russia have been backing opposite sides, but they largely managed this policy difference. In Nagorno-Karabakh too, Russia sees Nagorno-Karabakh as its backyard, but Turkey injected itself in the conflict directly by backing Azerbaijan militarily in the hopes that it can play a key role in the diplomatic process. But Russia denied Turkey that role. Moscow remains the key country that imposes the terms of the current status quo. But the two still seem like they're working together to resolve the issue. So Turkey and Russia have diverging policies, but neither side wants a 2015 style breakdown in relations. You might recall in 2015, Turkey downed a Russian jet, and after the incident, Russia slapped sanctions on Turkey. So I don't think either side wants a similar breakdown in ties, and I expect that to continue in 2021.
Gonul, we'll have to leave things there for now, but thank you very much for joining the program.
Thanks for having me.
Next up on the program, we'll be talking to Charles Lister. Charles is a senior fellow and the director of MEI's Syria and Countering Terrorism and Extremism programs. Charles, welcome back to the podcast, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks. Great to be with you.
Let's start with Syria. As the year begins, where do things stand, and what are the most pressing issues?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot to touch on, but I think big picture, Syria is clearly in a very bad state. This March, 2021, the conflict or the crisis will turn 10 years old, and those 10 years have really devastated the country. And I think only now are we really starting to see some of the consequences of that. So really, no matter what pocket or corner of the country you look at, there's really widespread instability, but instability of varying kinds. So if we look in the northwest, in areas of the northeast, if we look in the central desert and in the south of the country, there is ongoing conflict and terrorist insurgencies. Nationwide, I think probably the most significant new dynamic is the economic crisis, a really crippling crisis, which is seeing escalating fuel and bread shortages and continued inflation. I think now we're nearly back at 3,000 Syrian pounds to a single American dollar, which of course has essentially wiped out Syria's middle class, leaving at least 90% of the population living under the poverty line. I think we're also seeing increasing warlordism being established, probably permanently, in all of the areas currently controlled by the regime, which is roughly 2/3 of the country. Obviously, we've got Turkey occupying the northern portions of Syria. We continue to see Israel launching airstrikes and interventions against Iranian-linked forces. So, on that side of things, there's a great deal still going on, and all of it is destabilizing. And I think, kind of just looking forward and presently, humanitarian access continues to be a very significant issue and a challenging issue, complicated somewhat by sanctions, but also particularly by the interventions by the Syrian regime and its control over humanitarian access. And then, of course, we've got elections coming up in May or June this year. I think we all know who's going to, quote unquote, win those elections. But clearly the fact that elections are being held at all for the pro-regime alliance is of profound importance. And I think that will probably come to determine what I think will be a pretty significant year, 2021, in determining what Syria looks like going forward.
President-elect Joe Biden will be sworn in next week. What are your expectations for the new administration when it comes to U.S. Syria policy? What's likely to change and what will remain the same?
I mean, perhaps surprisingly, I think we're actually likely to see more status quo than any significant change, at least for the first perhaps 6 to 12 months, because the only things that are likely to change are mainly diplomatic, and it takes quite some time to sort of prepare the ground for actions on the diplomatic level. So I think for now, at least, we're likely to see a status quo. The campaign against ISIS is likely to continue. We've seen no indication either from appointments made by the transition or by senior officials within their campaign that there is any plan or that there would be any plan to withdraw US troops anytime soon from Syria, because their mission continues to be of importance, and it's also deemed within the campaign as sustainable. Our relationship with the Syrian Democratic Forces in the northeast and east of the country is likely both to continue, but also likely to be reinforced, particularly with the appointment of Brett McGurk as Middle East Director in the White House. I think sanctions are likely to remain in place, and if anything, we will likely continue to see sanctions introduced against the regime and its broader circles. I think that the main things, as I implied earlier, that we're likely to see change will take time to come to fruition. But the main one really is a sort of reassertion of American diplomacy on the Syrian file, which is something that's kind of been sorely lacking over the past 4 years of the Trump administration. Now, that diplomacy could be vis-a-vis Turkey and trying to mend our relationship with Turkey in relation to the crisis in Syria. I'm certain we will see a sort of renewed diplomatic push with Russia, probably aimed at exploring what a future political process would look like. And then probably inevitably, in some form, the Biden administration will seek to re-engage in negotiations with Iran. Now, most of those negotiations will likely focus on the nuclear issue, as I think we all expect. But I think inevitably Syria will come up in those discussions. Whether or not they're allowed as to be part of the negotiations, of course, is another issue. And then just zooming back to the humanitarian access issue, in July 2021, in July this year, in all likelihood, the Russians, through the United Nations, will veto any remaining cross-border humanitarian access into Syria. And that inevitably will become a big sort of geopolitical issue, which the Biden administration will surely seek to become involved in. And it's an open question where that ends up. The Biden administration could push to continue cross-border humanitarian aid, either with UN permission through a Security Council resolution or without it, as I think occurred until 2015. So that'll have to be an internal decision. But allowing humanitarian aid to continue to get to those who need it has never been more important. But of course, it has also become a sort of tool of political leverage for Russia and through its veto in New York.
Turning now to counterterrorism as well, what are the biggest challenges facing the region? Are ISIS and al-Qaeda stronger now than they were a year ago, given all the talk of resurgence, certainly on the part of ISIS?
So it's a good question with a slightly complicated answer. I mean, I think the first thing I would say is, unsurprisingly, as we've seen with incoming administrations for years now, the sort of focus of foreign policy is being placed on great power competition. I've seen, again, a kind of pivot to Asia being discussed, the importance of the rivalry with China, pushing back against Russia as well. We've kind of heard all of this before, although I do think it will come to determine a lot of the priorities of a Biden administration's foreign policy. But despite that, President-elect Biden will be coming into office, and he will face what I think at least is, when you look at it, the biggest in scale, the most dispersed, the most diverse, and the most experienced terrorism threats that have existed in recent history. And I think inevitably, whether a Biden administration will want to or not, part of our foreign policy will have to be aimed towards dealing with that very real reality. I mean, on the side of ISIS, despite its territorial defeat in Syria and Iraq, globally, ISIS remains alive and well. If anything, it's continuing to expand its operations, particularly in Africa. And even in its heartlands in Syria and Iraq, it is beginning to show signs, clear signs, I think, of a slow and methodical resurgence. And I think clearly that will be an issue, given the fact that we have troops deployed in many of those theaters. On the side of al-Qaeda, I think al-Qaeda's leadership, its central leadership, I think is undergoing a period of fairly significant internal crisis. But its affiliates dispersed around the world have adapted over the last decade or so, and adapted particularly to be more locally focused, to embed far more deeply in local environments and in more local environments than ever before. And I think that, if anything, is going to present the biggest challenge. And I guess from a CT perspective, that raises some important strategic questions. Many counterterrorism professionals will say, so long as the American homeland is safe, and it is relatively safe now, certainly safer than it has been for a long time, then our counterterrorism job is largely complete. First of all, I would say our homeland is not impregnable from a jihadist attack, either directed from abroad or inspired from abroad. But more importantly, homeland security from external threats is only kind of half of the challenge. And this wave of localism that we've seen develop, I think, is going to be a seriously profound geopolitical challenge, particularly in the developing world, especially in Africa, potentially in the Middle East, and likely in South Asia too. And if anything, both ISIS affiliates and also al-Qaeda affiliates are outplaying us on this game. We haven't learned well enough how to do counterinsurgency with local partners. We're very good at counterterrorism, but challenging locally embedded movements is something that we haven't done with particular effect. And frankly speaking, most of our local partners in those areas of the developing world are miserably failing to counter these groups. And I think that's going to come to determine a lot of focus, albeit kind of regionally focused, whether we're looking at Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, or elsewhere.
What do we know so far about how the Biden administration is likely to approach CT, and what lessons should it learn from what has and hasn't worked over the past 4 years?
So again, kind of the same answer as with the Syria discussion. We're likely to see largely status quo. I think a lot of the indications of that come from President-elect Biden's own words on counterterrorism. He coined his own phrase, counterterrorism plus, as essentially trying to thread the needle that I was just earlier discussing, of trying to combine counterterrorism with counterinsurgency. And his solution to it, which he calls CT plus, is what we've essentially seen implemented in recent years in Syria and Iraq. It was a light footprint, special forces heavy deployment that was aimed specifically at partnering with a much larger force of local partners, with the aim of sort of utilizing America's superior CT capabilities alongside the inevitably superior counterinsurgent capabilities of a local partner. And so it's kind of got that longer term investment seeded into it in terms of capacity building. And I think in many respects, and again, also gleaning from comments made by senior campaign and transition officials, there is a belief that this approach is both sustainable and also effective. So I think we're likely to see that continue, whether we're looking in places like Syria and Iraq or in Afghanistan, where I think the transition is very aware of the need to end forever wars, but also very aware of the dangers of prematurely withdrawing from them. And that's where I think probably Afghanistan is the best example, where clearly there is a continuing CT challenge and CT threat that is not yet dealt with, and that our local partner in Kabul is incapable of successfully dealing with by itself. And so I think status quo probably sums up a lot of what we're going to see. I would tag on to that answer also a sort of clear reminder, as we're witnessing domestically here in the US now, that I think in the years ahead, we're going to witness some very real domestic terrorism challenges, particularly from the far right or the populist or from populist militant circles, whatever phrase that we want to use. And I think that's going to provide a great deal a fairly significant challenge to deal with over the years. Whether or not that distracts us from similarly challenging environments abroad, I guess, remains to be seen. But there's definitely going to be a domestic CT angle to the story that we'll see shape up in the coming months, I think.
On that sobering note, Charles, we'll have to leave things there, but thank you very much for joining the program today.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
That's our program for today, but I'd like to thank all of the guests from across MEI who joined us for this special 2021 preview podcast. I'd also like to thank our audience for listening in and our production team for their work on today's program. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.